Welcome to Easter Egg Hunting, a show that dissects your favorite video games looking for hidden secrets and Easter eggs. We're going to try our hardest to show you all and any Easter eggs we can find in any game, and we'll even be throwing in some trivia as well. We'll be covering the Legend of Zelda series this time around, so let's start off with the first of the main series Zelda games, the original The Legend of Zelda. The Easter eggs in Zelda 1 start almost immediately. If you name your character Zelda on the name input screen, the game lets you start the second quest before completing the game. For those not in the know, the second quest is a harder remix version of the main quest that's unlocked by beating the game. For now, we'll be sticking to the first quest. There's also a possible reference to Norse mythology near the start of the game. In Norse mythology, there's a dragon named Nidhogg that gnaws at the foot of the giant tree Yggdrasil. Similar to that, the first dungeon in Zelda is entered through a giant tree, and the dungeon under it has a dragon as its boss. Moving on to the second dungeon, you'll encounter the Dodongo boss. The name Dodongo can be derived from Dodon, the Japanese onomatopoeia for the sound of an explosion. This fits in contextually as the boss has a weakness to bombs. The third dungeon in the game is named and shaped after a manji. Manji are symbols often used to mark the locations of Buddhist temples on maps, amongst other things. They often spark controversy due to their visual similarity to swastikas. Within this dungeon, we first encounter the Dark Nut enemies. The Japanese name for a Dark Nut can be translated as Tart Knuckle, romanized as Tato Naku. This implies a relation between Dark Nuts and Iron Knuckles, as they share the same naming convention. The game's Japanese manual also states that the third boss, Manhadla, is a large piranha plant from the Super Mario Bros. Series. In subsequent games, like the Oracle of Seasons, this connection is made more apparent in Manhadla's colors and design. Within the game's fourth dungeon, the player will encounter the shield-eating like enemies. Like-likes are derived from the Japanese proverb, Tateku Mushi Mosukisuki. The proverb translates as even water pepper eating bugs have preferences, and roughly means everyone has their own preferences, or even everyone has their own like-likes. Like-likes are a reference to the proverb because of their taste for eating shields. The Japanese hiragana for shield and water pepper are very similar in spelling. If you were to slightly corrupt the word shield into water pepper, the like-likes would be similar to the water pepper eating bugs from the proverb. It's also possible that the fourth boss, Gleeok, is based on the Hydra of Greek mythology. Gleeok is a multi-headed lizard, and every time you beat it, you see it at a later point in the game with more heads than before. In Greek mythology, the Hydra grows 2 heads every time one head is chopped off. Moving on to the fifth dungeon, we'll find the DidYouKnowGaming boss. According to the Japanese manual, DidYouKnowGaming is a giant Unira from the game Clu Land. It's also worth noting that the Octoroks in Zelda also bear a striking resemblance to the Uniras, and the sprites used for the rupees in The Legend of Zelda also come from Clu Land. Wrapping up the first Zelda, all of the game's dungeons have names, and the shape of each dungeon is based on this name. The names are Eagle, Moon, the aforementioned Manji, Snake, Lizard, Dragon, Demon, Lion, and Death Mountain, which is represented as a skull. All of the dungeon maps can be pieced together to make a rectangular grid. This was likely done to save space on the cartridge. This is also true for the second quest dungeons, which can spell out Zelda. Now we've reached Zelda II, The Adventure of Link. This game is easily the least well documented of the Zelda series, probably due to its mixed reception, but it still has a few interesting Easter eggs and secrets that we are going to share with you. One of the first biomes in the game is the desert area. If the player goes into these areas, they can encounter the Geldarm enemies. The name of the Geldarm is similar to that of the Geld Man from A Link to the Past, another desert-faring creature. In Japanese, Geld is written and read the same as Gerudo, suggesting a connection between the Sand Monsters Geldarm and Geld Man, but also the Gerudo race featured in later games. This connection is lost in translation and is the first use of the word Gerudo in the series. If the player is defeated during a confrontation, they'll see the game over screen. The Western versions of the game actually reuse sound effects from Punch-Out, and they sound noticeably similar to Soda Popinski's laugh. The original Japanese game over screen just had Ganon making a generic roaring sound. If the player goes to the town of Rudo, they can find a man who states, "I am error." It was thought for a long time that this was an actual error, and the game was incorrectly reading the character's name. However, it seems to be a joke by Nintendo. There's another character linked to error named Bagu. Bagu is the Japanese romanization for bug. Together, these characters are Error and Bug, and act as a technical reference to errors and programming bugs. The game's localization staff were supposed to rename Bagu to Bug in order to complete the joke, but the humorous intention must have been lost on them. Ironically, Bagu's naming was the mistake in the English version, not Error's. If the player starts heading to Saria Town, they'll come across Maruge Swamp. The swamp's name was inaccurately translated into English when the game was localized. The Japanese name Maruge Numa translates to Morgue Swamp, tying in with the names of other grim-sounding locations like Death Mountain and Valley of Death. Past the swamp is a bridge where the player will see Bago Bago enemies. Because these enemies have a similar naming convention and behavior to Mario's Cheep Cheep enemies, they might be a reference to the Mushroom Kingdom's fish. There's a grave in Saria Town, and in the Japanese version of the game, the grave reads, "The hero Lodo rests here." This is a reference to Dragon Quest's legendary hero Lodo or Rodo. Square made a similar reference to Zelda in the Japanese version of Final Fantasy I with a grave in Elfheim that reads, "Here lies Link." This reference is fitting as Elfheim is themed around elves and Link resembles an elf. In the Western NES release of Final Fantasy, the gravestone says, "Here lies Erdrick," referencing the English name of Dragon Quest's legendary hero. If the player moves on to Death Mountain, they can encounter the Akiman. These enemies are possibly a reference to the Devil from Devil World, a 1984 NES game designed by Shigeru Miyamoto and Takashi Tezuka. In addition to the similar appearance, the same fireball sound effect from Devil World was reused in Zelda II. If a confrontation starts in the graveyards, it's possible to see the Moa enemies. These creatures are based on the concept of Hitodama from Japanese folklore. Hitodama are ghostly flaming balls that represent a deceased human soul. Within Midoro Palace are the Aneru enemies. The an in their name is the Japanese onomatopoeia that means to open your mouth wide, describing their behavior. The unnamed floating eye found in East Hyrule actually has a name in the Japanese version and is called Giruboku. The name evokes the Japanese onomatopoeia giru, meaning to stare at something, and possibly boketo, meaning to gaze vacantly. Also in this area are the Geru enemies, which seem to be based on the Japanese tree lizard. Now in the Ocean Palace, or Palace on the Sea, the player can find the Mago enemies. Their name is likely derived from Maho, a Japanese word meaning magic, witchcraft, and sorcery. Mago is also the Portuguese, Spanish, and Italian word for magician. Now we've come to the final dungeon in the game, the Great Palace. In the palace are the Fokker enemies, whose names are likely based on the German word Vogel, which means bird. Their name could also be based on the Dutch aircraft manufacturer Fokker. The name of the boss in the dungeon, Thunderbird, may be a reference to the mythological Native American beast of the same name. Speaking of bosses, it's been noted that the relationship between Link and Link's shadow is similar to Peter Pan and his shadow. Both characters struggle with their shadows and both defeat their shadows in order to move on with their quests. Both shadows also have similar moves and actions. This connection is important to note as Link was directly inspired by Disney's Peter Pan. We've reached the third and arguably the best 2D Zelda game in the franchise, The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. After completing the game's introduction sequence and saving Zelda from the basement of Hyrule Castle, the player can go right and enter the cemetery. Pushing a gravestone creates a chance of spawning a Poe enemy. The Poe's name may be derived from the famous poet Edgar Allan Poe, who is known for his dark, gloomy works. The name could also come from the Chinese word Po, meaning spirit. Towards the magic shop is a witch named Syrup. Her and her daughter Maple are an obvious reference to maple syrup. However, Syrup's reference to Shakespeare is not quite as obvious. After giving her a mushroom and acquiring the magic powder from inside the shop, Syrup will say, "Double, double, toil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble," referencing the play Macbeth. In the play, the same line is used by the Weird Sisters. Their chant is used to conjure a prophecy of Macbeth's eventual defeat at the hands of Macduff. If the player goes to Kakariko Village, they'll meet Sahasrara. His name may be a reference to the 7th chakra of Hinduism, the Sahasrara. This isn't the only reference to be found in Kakariko. There are portraits of Mario in houses around the village, and pulling on them gives the player some rupees. Also in Kakariko is a house owned by a woman dressed in blue. A cuckoo can be found in a pot under the house. Using the magic powder on it turns the cuckoo into a woman. She explains that the weathercock in the center of the village watches Link harass the cuckoos and sends cuckoos to attack Link when he hits them. Make sure you subscribe to DidYouKnowGaming for more facts and trivia. Let us know if we missed any Easter eggs, but keep in mind we've only just started A Link to the Past and there's more to come. And if you'd like to watch another video that has absolutely nothing to do with Zelda at all, then check out my video on Sonic Adventure 2, because I don't have a Zelda video to promote yet. Maybe I will soon. Don't hold me to that, but please subscribe. That'd be awesome of you, and have a good day. Cool. Bye.